All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I believe we are live. My name is Mitch Ploskonka. I wrote this book, The Bad Poor, Race, Class, and the Rise of Grit Lit, which I'll be talking to you a little bit about today. Um, I want to note that if there are any questions as we go, you can feel free to drop it in the chat. The way this is live streamed via Zoom, I can't see them or you, uh, but our friends at LSU Press are monitoring the chat and will help moderate the Q&A session when I'm done with my spiel. Um, so first, I'd like to thank everyone at the press, James Long, the acquisitions editor, that sort of shockingly to me showed an interest in this manuscript. Scott Romine, the series editor and a big deal in Southern literary studies. Min Marcus, the production editor, for getting the manuscript across the finish line. And James Wilson and Corey Calabria for seeing if they can't find some folks to read it. I can't tell you what a thrill it is to add my work to the Southern Literary Studies series. Again, in my field, it's a big deal. You know, it's sort of surreal to be in the series that has published key texts. You know, people like Lewis Rubin, Scott Romine, Fred Hobson, Michael Kraling. These are all, in my opinion, canon-shaping voices that I also reference a lot in this book. So again, to be in that series is just very cool. Uh, my plan today is to give a quick overview of my personal connection to the project. I will read a small bit from the book. I'll talk a little bit about what I mean when I say grit lit. I'll run through, in fairly broad terms, the core arguments of the book, and sort of very briefly, kind of what the shape of the book is, you know, what the chapters are doing. And I'll end with a few words about why I think this subject matters, particularly in this sort of socio-political moment. First, I want to take a moment to appreciate the cover, which I didn't have anything to do with, but I do think sets the scene for the book. You know, rural marginality, it's not pastoral or romanticized. You've got this sort of bush hog scrub grass around this rusted out trailer with weeds growing up around it. It's this sort of, you know, little island or pocket of mobile occupancy in a sort of more wild landscape. You've got this red panel trying to keep what's inside private. And of course, the color is given off, you know, rust or damage or violence. You've got this dark tree line in the background looming over everything, maybe giving a sense of, you know, heavy, dark history pushing down on it. But crucially, I think you've got this sort of uh, you've got a light, you know what I mean? And I think thinking about my book, I wouldn't necessarily call it hope, um, but at least something is being illuminated, you know, brought to light for a deeper look. And uh, then my favorite detail is this burned out, dead looking grass behind the trailer, which literally sort of connects to a common way of determining where these mobile meth labs are, since they'll sort of dump their toxic waste out of the back and it kills the vegetation. Um, but more symbolically, I think it gestures to the mark that poverty and drugs, that kind of thing, leaves on the land itself, and sort of hints at the environmentalism that is increasingly found in this type of literature. So anyway, I love the cover. I think it is a grit-lit text in its own right. Uh, I suppose it would be uh, fitting to get into talking about this book from a personal place because this book really started from a personal place. I came to Grit Lit uh, sort of through my own uneasy relationship with rural Kentucky, where I'm from, my my shifting sense of Southern identity, and the phrase white trash itself. You know, this is a phrase that can be insulting, can be performative, defensive, can even be strangely tempting at times. So I'm going to read an abridged excerpt from my preface. This will be the only time I read from the book. Uh, but I do think it actually does a more efficient job of kind of summarizing my approach to it than I could probably do here. So bear with me for a couple minutes as I read from the preface. And in this passage, I'll explain the identity problem that eventually became the book's critical problem. So, growing up in rural Kentucky, I thought I was about as lightened as they come. I was a strong student, listened to alternative music, I read a lot of books, and I made a calculated effort to go against political cultural grains. I was open-minded, sometimes defiant, and usually antagonistic to my life in the sticks. Plus, my parents were educated transplants from Pennsylvania, carpetbaggers, and they were divorced, which was another strike against us. Much as I was proud of being a semi-outsider, of being able to distance myself from my surroundings, my Southern dialect would get made fun of when I visited my parents' families, even though I'd swear I barely had an accent. Outside of home, school, and my trips to the North, I was rebellious and indulgent, intrigued by the seedier sides of town. I resented the rude people in the North and felt right at home in trailer parks. But it wasn't until I went to college that I realized I might be white trash. And it was right in my backyard that I realized this. I didn't move away like I sometimes said I would, at least not right away. There was a liberal arts school 20 miles away and the closest big city outside of making the trip to Lexington. I moved into the dorm and began interacting with my classmates, and although I was a townie, I never felt so far from home. Not only was I not enlightened, but I was backwards, a hick. I thought I was intelligent, even countercultural, but I had never met a Jew, a Muslim, or an openly gay person. I went from feeling like the smartest person in my high school to being petrified that the professor would ask me to identify the subject of a sentence. Many students were from Kentucky, but not many seemed to be from my part of Kentucky. I eventually accepted, at first begrudgingly and later proudly, being the redneck of my friend group. I began to feel more authentic than my private school peers, even though it was always slightly performative. But even as I began to feel that my budding Southernness somehow made me exceptional, I also began to learn about the violence of Southern exceptionalism, the breadth of historical inequality. Should I be ashamed to be proud? Also, around this time, I read my first Grit Lit story, which is a particularly deranged short story by Larry Brown that my professor described as Southern Gothic on steroids. I was shocked by its ferocity. Here was a Southerner who seemed to lay bare my regional anxieties and brutally articulate a lesson I'd glossed over. There are many different Souths. Ones I feel like I belong to, ones I feel denied access to, ones I'm fiercely proud of, and ones I'm deeply ashamed of. Naturally, as countless Southerners have done, and despite my continued resentment, I moved to the Midwest and took my regional identity baggage with me. But this time I was determined to parse Gritlet's place in Southern literature and the poor white's place in Southern culture. In graduate school, when I would bring up what I wanted to study, I'd either get laughs or indignant warnings. Watch out, they seemed to say. That might be a tricky line to walk. And of course it is. But as the promise of a post-racial America dwindled after Obama, class divisions deepened, monuments fell, certain flags flew while others burned, it made it all the more apparent that some nuance was needed. So I live in the Midwest and study the South, an outsider by blood and an insider by choice and acculturation. Not dissimilar, I would imagine, to grit lit writers trying to produce authentic but always slightly performative art in the shadow of elite Southern literature. They seem to agonize over their craft, culture, and identity. It often left them bitter, jaded, sometimes dead. But they looked deep and spoke up, and that's usually a painful process, not just because you're frequently made to feel less than, a discredit to your race, a piece of trash, but because you're also a participant in a centuries-old project of making others feel less than. Larry Brown once said in an interview, "Whatever good is in this world has to have teeth in it if evil is to be dealt with." Grit Lit, literature by and about poor whites shows that to deal with evil, you have to deal with difference. To understand yourself, you have to understand others, and to change people's perceptions, you have to change your own. So I think that gets at, my personal motivations for working on this project, and I think sort of sets up uh, some of the larger move that the books end up making. Okay. And this is where gritlit comes in for me. At first, the term seems almost self-explanatory. It's gritty literature. It's about rough places and rough people. It deals with stuff like poverty, violence, addiction, lots of meth, and the sense that something has gone wrong in the rural South, or perhaps has always been wrong. And that is a big part of it. Gritlit often does deal with difficult, sometimes brutal material. One of the arguments in my book, though, is that this shorthand is both useful and misleading. If gritlit only means, gritty Southern stories, then it becomes just another marketable aesthetic, a way of selling poverty and exotic rural authenticity to the reading class. The writers I'm looking at are doing something I think more complicated than that. So I define gritlit as a mode of Southern storytelling by and about poor white Southerners that try to move these figures from object to subject. So poor white characters have obviously appeared in American and Southern literature for a long time, um, but they're usually found as jokes or villains or victims, right? Symbolic containers of everything that's wrong with the South or the wider country. Grit lit emerges when writers that are from or very close to this world start asking what it means to tell those stories from the inside. Which is why I don't treat grit lit as a traditional genre. And I'm also not saying that these writers got together and said, let's go start a literary movement. It doesn't have one stable form. It can present as memoir, literary naturalism, dirty realism, more traditional Southern Gothic, crime and detective fiction, environmental activist writing, even increasingly like popular television, film, and comic books. And I think the messiness is part of the point. These writers are trying out different forms because they're trying to answer a difficult question about their identity. How do we tell stories about a group that has usually been spoken for? And where are the authors in these stories? Because again, these writers are from the world, but they're always a little bit removed from it. So there's that tension too. One of the lines I use in the book is that identity is the destination and genre is the journey. So when I ask, what is grit lit? I'm not just asking what books belong on a Goodreads list, for example. I'm asking what this collection of disparate authors reveals about poor white identity, Southern literature, and the stuff that comes with that, race, class, uh, and this desire for self-fashioning from the inside out and from the bottom rung up. So that's a big part of my argument then. Writers like Harry Crews, Larry Brown, Dorothy Allison, Jim Grimsley, Rick Bragg, Tom Franklin, and many others, they take up figures that had been hanging around Southern literature for a long time, this white trash figure, and they add lots of nuance. And that's the key shift, right? Poor white Southerners are no longer in this literature, just symbols in somebody else's story. They become subjects trying to explain themselves. And it's not simply uh, a purely redemptive process. And that's partly where race becomes so important to this book. Because again, poor white identity is not only a class identity, it's a racial identity. And one of the problems I'm trying to address uh, is that criticism on Gritlit has often been very good on class, poverty, and authenticity, but less direct about race. This sidestepping, this happens partly because Gritlit uh, seems to want to be read as a literature that's only about class. So race can sometimes get treated as background or as a distraction, or often as a conflated experience, between white and black poverty. And sometimes gritlit texts will reinforce this sort of, sidestepping instinct. And that matters because the term poor white and white trash are both class and race, right? There's the poor part and the white part. Poor white Southerners are often treated as marginal figures in American cultures, but their stories are still bound up within that larger history of whiteness, even if they are, as Matt Ray famously described, not quite white. So the book tries to keep class and race in sort of the same frame rather than treating them as separate issues. Um, so this book is not trying to just turn Gritlit into some sort of, redemption story or an escape narrative, right? Like I got out, now I can look back on it fondly. And it's not meant to be, poor white apologetics, right? It's not all hillbilly elegy. I'm not arguing that these writers simply rescue poor white identity from stereotypes or reveal, the hidden nobility of the poor white South. And they're certainly not all rowing in the same direction or for the same reasons. But when we look closely at a few foundational texts, we see them drifting towards the same uh, shared questions and concerns. So the book's larger claim then is that Gritlit shows an attempt to fashion a productive poor white identity by reckoning with difference. What we notice is that in their own ways, the authors show that this project of self-actualization, who am I, right? Uh, that they're often seeking through the process of writing has to happen, finally, by thinking about its relationship to things like blackness, to gender, to sexuality and disability. And as I mentioned, they also are arriving at these questions through form, right? Through these genre explorations, which become tools for working through what their poor white identity can mean and how it can be best represented. So my book, I try to trace Gritlit's attempts to answer what I think of as its sort of marching orders. It's also the title of the first chapter. Who are we and how do we tell our stories? So those marching orders, they give the book its shape, So it goes through these where these poor white representations come from, how Gritlit emerges, and how major writers answer that question in different genres and at different moments. So the introduction that establishes the history and scholarship of poor whites in America, how they've been represented in political discourse, popular culture, Southern literature, and literary criticism. It traces the history of largely representing poor white Southerners from the outside. Okay. In other words, the intro explains the sort of representational problem that Gritlit inherits. The first main chapter is the broadest, besides the intro, I guess. It defines Gritlit in more detail than I did here, and it traces its movement from sort of a Southern literary niche to a somewhat broader cultural category. It also establishes the book's main through line, Gritlit's relationship between genre and identity. The next three chapters progress sort of chronologically and focus on what I think of as the big three of Gritlit: Harry Crews, Larry Brown, and Dorothy Allison. So chapter 2 is mainly close reading Harry Crews and Childhood, Biography of a Place, which I cite as a sort of foundational Gritlit text, and Crews as the foundational voice in Gritlit, especially for thinking about things like performing authenticity, Southern myth making, and this tension between elite Southern literature and whatever it is that he is writing. Chapter 3 turns to Larry Brown and his fiction and looks at literary naturalism, masculinity, representations of disability, and of course, running throughout all these chapters is the topic of race. Chapter 4 then moves to Bastard Out of Carolina by Dorothy Allison. In some ways, perhaps the single most important Brit Lit text, at least the most widely studied and talked about, banned. In my book's progression, Allison is really the one that pushes these identity questions further, right? And into some realm more involved with intersectionality. Chapter 5, my last main chapter, it breaks from this author per chapter structure and focuses, the full chapter is focused on race, particularly some more recent texts and how they take up this topic of poor white racism and the racial history of the South. Here I'm looking at texts by Tom Franklin, Jim Grimsley, and Rick Bragg specifically. Conclusion then turns to Gritlit's expansion into popular culture. So increasingly we see it, the same sort of characteristics and content coming up more in crime fiction, Netflix television shows, films and adaptations, comic books, maybe video games. So I ask in the conclusion, what happens when a literature that began as an anti-romantic, self-critical mode becomes marketable, and it potentially ends up uh, romanticizing the deromanticization, if that makes sense. Uh, so the book moves from broadly, from definition to foundational authors to race to sort of this popular expansion. So that's the shape of the book. And I want to sort of quickly wrap up by stepping back from the literature itself, because I think the questions that Gritlit raises, they never stay neatly inside literature, even if that's primarily where I'm living in this book, right? But why does this stuff matter? And of course, one answer is literary. These writers deserve serious attention. The ones that I write about at length, okay, Harry Crews, Dorothy Allison, Larry Brown, etc., but also other writers, right? There's a long list: Ron Rash, Daniel Woodrell, William Gay, David Joy, Chris Offutt, and many more. I think deserve to be talked about together. They do important things for Southern literature and are just worth digging into in their own right. The larger answer is cultural and political. Poor whites have been made to carry a lot of meaning in American culture: laziness, violence, some version of authenticity, racial resentment. They could be stand-ins for national decline or populist anger or political danger. They get invoked whenever the country wants to explain something about itself, especially something ugly. We saw this very clearly after 2016, when poor white and working class white voters got thrust into the spotlight, as they occasionally are. Suddenly, everyone wanted to explain the white working class from Trump country, the forgotten Americans. Some of that attention was useful because things like poverty and deindustrialization, the opioid addiction, maybe even things like cultural homogenization are real, worth talking about. Much of that conversation also became maybe too easy. It often treated poor whites like as noble victims of economic abandonment, or maybe as irredeemable racists and fools. And I don't think either version is uh, fully adequate or, again, particularly nuanced. The harder truth is that these things can be true at once. Poor white people can be economically exploited and politically manipulated and still cling to their whiteness. They can be harmed by the same political systems they support and still find meaning in those systems because those systems promise hierarchy. And that contradiction is not incidental nor accidental, right? It has real implications. I mean, J.D. Vance's career is one obvious example. He wrote a sort of version of poor white self-explanation, perhaps exploitation, to the Senate, to the vice presidency, and who knows? His alliance with Trump shows how easily these stories of poor white suffering can be folded into a politics that offers surface recognition, some socio-cultural resentment and symbolic power much more readily than, you know, basic material improvement. So for me, part of the value of Gritlit is not that it excuses this poor white racism or explains it away through class. It's also not that it gives us a cleaner, more respectable poor white identity to admire or to be weaponized. Its value, I think, is that it forces us to hold these multiple truths in our mind at once, right? And that's something literature and hopefully literary scholarship can offer. Uh, so that is my spiel. Again, I really appreciate people hanging out and listening. I will turn things over to Corey and I'll do my level best at answering any questions, uh, even though I'm not as good on at talking on the spot, but I'll try to be coherent.
Thank you so much, Mitch. I'm really excited to talk to you about this book. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I did do a little shout out. So thank you, Colette, for tuning in from Houston. We got Jenny Fisher from, is it Worcester, Ohio? If it's not, I'm sorry. And Tiffany, thank you so much for tuning in from Metro Atlanta. As Mitch mentioned in the beginning, and in case you missed it and tuned in a little bit later, we're doing a Q&A right now, which just means that if you have a question, put it in the chat and we'll ask Mitch live. I do see that question here from Tiffany. I'm going to ask that in a little bit. I think that's a great question, but I think I'm going to ask a couple questions first just to get us started. So I haven't forgotten about you. I see you, Penny, in the chat saying very interesting. Thank you for being here with us. I appreciate it. One more little announcement before we get started. There is a 40% off discount code pinned to the chat. So if you don't have this book and you would like it, now is a good time to get it at a great price. So yeah, I'm going to get started reading some questions. And as I see questions in the chat, I'll ask them. So like I said, if you've got anything on your mind, please ask it. But yeah, the first thing I wanted to ask you, Mitch, about just about Gritlit is, would you say have the confines of Gritlit changed at all since like Harry Crews either wrote under or was given the label? Or would you say it's kind of the same thing now as it was? Like, is it as a genre?
I definitely think it's changing and expanding. So in the conclusion in particular, I talk about there's a couple things that have really changed through its development. I sort of situate Gritlit into sort of three generations or waves. Like the first generation was largely just Harry Crews, sort of, setting the tone for it. The second one was the sort of height, I would think, of Gritlit, at least in terms of critical reception, its sort of literary prestige. That's the generation of Dorothy Allison and Larry Brown, for example, sort of the 90s. And then I would characterize the third wave, which sort of, I guess, 2000s, 2010s, what we're sort of in right now, uh, would describe it by its sort of proliferation. So I think um, people have picked up on the marketability of it. So, the idea of rough South landscapes and, violence and drugs and all of that. For whatever reason in the sort of popular culture, uh, got a lot of views, got a lot of clicks, and so you see the literature moving a little bit away from the sort of literariness that I might have used to describe it in its earlier iterations, and a little bit more towards um, more
It looks
popular
like, okay,
conceptions.
you just cut out for a little bit, but I think that we are back. Cool.
Oh, sorry
I think,
about that.
no, that may have actually been my internet, so I'm sorry about that. Let us know if we're all good. If there is any issues still, just let us know in the chat. So I'm just going to ask you the next question then, Mitch. Are you there?
Yes, although your image is frozen, but I think I still got your audio. Oop, there you are.
Cool. Let's Mitch was clear. Okay, so I think I'm the problem. Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to ask you a question here, but I would like to um, say this comment from Colette in the chat. Colette says, "I'm surprised that Mary Carr didn't make your list of Gritlit greats."
Um, yeah, I don't know. I'm not terribly familiar. Don't know that I've actually read anything by her, but I will definitely check her out.
All right, so the next question here, I'm going to ask this question from Tiffany. Tiffany asks, what do you feel like the two or three pressing issues for the South are at the moment? This is maybe a broader question, obviously, than the book, but I was wanted to ask that if you'd like to answer to kind of any capacity.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the to keep it in the realm of where I'm talking about in this particular book. What at least is something these authors are trying to do is just the issue of self-representation. You know what I mean? Of the history, especially of poor Southerners, has been one where their story is told kind of for them. You know what I mean? And for reasons uh, that other people use and sort of decide. And so one thing I think that Gritlit is offering is a way to tell their own stories, and to kind of, in a lot of ways, struggle through what that means and what the effects are. Um, so that would be a big one. Another one, honestly, especially as it relates to, the sort of poor Southerners, is uh, kind of acting and voting against their sort of material interests. You know what I mean? Of voting for policy that honestly does not benefit them materially, but instead reinforces maybe sort of, I don't know, older hierarchies, or more traditional systems. And I see that as a particularly pressing thing.
You kind of have mentioned that in my first question, you responded that Gritlit has kind of evolved and we've kind of seen different iterations of what it is. What's like an example of like a recent book or show or some kind of media that you would consider Gritlit?
Yeah, so um some of these cable shows that have like anti-heroes, so like a Sons of Anarchy or Ozarks, um, Justified, maybe my personal favorite of them. And then there's also just a lot of sort of film adaptations of sort of gritlit texts, you know what I mean? So there's adaptations of Larry Brown's Joe or Bastard Out of Carolina, or they made a Hillbilly Elegy movie that had a big budget and a big release on Netflix. So I think those kinds of texts are operating in the same sort of milieu. Again, not always for the same sort of reasons or towards the same ends, I would say. But I do think in some ways they're kind of co-opting I guess, the vibe of Gritlit for their purposes.
I actually have a great question here from Aaron Good in the chat. Aaron, thanks for asking this. But I do want to preface it because I'm kind of interested in this kind of more broadly based on the kind of changing nature of Gritlit. So Aaron asks, what do you think of the term Southern Gothic? And I'll just add on my bit that which is that um, Southern Gothic maybe is something that was once maybe more time and place oriented and now is almost a little bit like vibey, if that makes sense. And I'm wondering if Gritlit is maybe kind of moving away from this specific time and place classness that it is.
Yeah, I think it definitely could be sort of bursting out of its immediate context, especially since, as you know, in addition to being found more widely spread in places like television and film and stuff like that, it's also gone more national, so you've got a lot more less specifically Southern, what what we would think of as grit lit. So, Bonnie Joe Campbell in Michigan, people, um, out west or from various places. So that I think contributes to it too, right? It doesn't seem to be this sort of Southern only enterprise increasingly. Not that it ever fully was, but you did see most of the authors kind of confined to the South like that. Um, so yeah, I think that could help uh, explain that expansion.
You mentioned that, you know, throughout the book, you talk about certain authors and how they confront race in their world and their in the authenticity that they're creating. And I was wondering if you could maybe give me one or two examples of contrasting ways that authors are portraying race in their work, and then maybe also answer if you feel like there's been a progression, a more general progression about how gritlit authors confront race, or if it is just like a person to person thing.
Um, Definitely a progression, at least broadly. So for example, in Childhood Biography of Place, the sort of seminal memoir of Harry Crews, he talks about his black neighbors and what really characterized his sort of interaction, and this is typical of a lot of this stuff. Um, is the conflation of the poor white and black experience. That is, I never thought about us particularly differently because they're poor and I'm poor and we're all poor. Um, that's fairly typical. And to be honest, that seems to be one of the reason that, some of the criticism that has been written about the scholarship about some of these grit-lit texts, um, it's sort of the reason that they use to kind of not focus on it very much. But again, I would argue that just because they're not talking about race directly doesn't mean it's not there. You know what I mean? It's sort of always wrapped up, just like class is. So that was sort of, the initial thing, right? Oh, we share the same sort of experience. Um, Larry Brown sort of complicates this a little bit. So Dirty Work, his first book, is a conversation between two disabled Vietnam veterans, one white and one black. And so it comes up a lot more explicitly and directly. But even still, right, they seem to fall into the same similar thing, right? Like the thing that unites us is our shared disability, our shared service in the Marines, and our shared sort of poverty, not race. So you see something similar there too. And I do think in many ways, Bastard Out of Carolina is the book that really starts to put pressure on this a little bit more. So in that book, her associations with Black gospel music and the racism that she sees in the people around her pushes her towards her own sort of intersectional understanding of her identity. Dorothy Allison through her sort of surrogate character in that book, Bone. Um, Allison as a female lesbian writer uh, always wanted to think about these things together. She said her identity is a sort of lattice of different things. Class is one of them, or sexuality is one of them, and race has to be one of them. And I think what I love about Bastard Out of Carolina is it kind of puts pressure on all these different identities at different times. You know what I mean? And says, oh, can I invest myself in whiteness? Not fully. Can I invest myself in, ableism? That doesn't quite work either. And at the end, it's, what, I'm a collection of all these different things. And so I think she did a lot to kind of, broaden the conversation, kind of break it a little bit out of the whole, oh, well, we're both poor, kind of conception of it. And then you've got in the more sort of recent generations, you've got writers that are taking on much more explicitly this sort of topic of poor white racism, and uh, the history of poor white and black sort of interaction and violence in Southern history. So Tom Franklin is an author that I would single out here, that does a lot with that. His novel Crooked Letter, um, is about the sort of, racist sins of the past and how, that stuff develops. And so, yeah, you see a lot more interest in that as the mode of grit lit develops.
Thank you for that. That was a great answer. Um, I got a question here from Chris Boone Payne that is a great question. So thank you for asking it, Chris. Chris wants to know how you relate Gritlit to your students at ATI and what is their response to it in general.
Yes, great question. Well, I do teach it. I teach it every semester. So I teach at Ohio State's Agricultural Technical Institute, which is a 2-year college within Ohio State. We're on the Worcester campus. And so I teach primarily agriculturally focused students, farm students. So we get a lot of students that are from, rural backgrounds. It's one of the reasons when I started teaching there that I thought it could be a really useful fit for this kind of literature. I'm mainly teaching, first year composition courses, so I don't necessarily have a semester to, focus on a grit lit seminar, for example. So I tend to stick to one main text when I do teach it. And I try to frame it pretty carefully. A lot of the content can be pretty heavy or disturbing. So, careful content warnings and stuff like that. I also try to set it up a little bit, like, with some historical, cultural context. I usually try and get them to read an earlier short story, something like A Rose for Emily by Faulkner, or maybe a Flannery O'Connor story like Good Country People, something that gives the sort of Southern Gothic, playbook that Gritlit is adopting and adapting. And then we read a full book. So the last 2 years, I've taught the book American Salvage by Bonnie Jo Campbell. Those are stories that are set in rural Michigan, which I thought would work well with my Ohio students. That book is now out of print, so I'm switching to teaching Bastard out of Carolina in the fall, which I'm really excited about. Um, so because it's not a straight up literature course, I keep my concepts for reading it fairly broad. So, elements of close reading, some basic literary terminology. Oftentimes the students they think that, oh, this can be literature, you can write literature about this topic. And it also is really useful uh, for getting at some of the, my broader academic commandments that I'm always preaching to my students, nuance and reflection. And so for my students in particular, I think this literature is a pretty productive entry point into it. Uh, it's funny, I I like noticing how certain students relate or kind of don't to the material. So some students will recognize the sort of uh, environments or milieu of Gritlit. I know that world. You know what I mean? But other ones, even ones from rural backgrounds, but maybe who have, I don't know, more respectable pedigrees. It's just as sort of foreign or exotic to them as it probably is to the uh, coastal reading classes, for example. So that's an interesting thing too, to see, to what extent does it do students find it relatable? Either way, right? It becomes good fodder for broadening their sense of what literature can be about. And I think sometimes it helps with some of that buy-in and engagement.
I've got about three, maybe four questions on deck for Mitch left before we go today. So if you do have a question that you'd like to ask him and you haven't asked it yet, now's a good time to put it in the chat. Otherwise, we're going to be moving along with a question that I'm trying to figure out how to word. But you did talk about JD Vance earlier, and you do mention in your intro that you don't consider Hillbilly Elegy to be gritlit because, as you say, gritlit does not usually offer sweeping explanations, tidy solutions, or any unified vision of the Southern underclass and its people. That being said, he did make your book, right? And so my question sort of generally is, um, maybe this isn't about JD Vance, but someone who's kind of like claimed, a poor Southern white identity, or maybe could be kind of considered gritlit, now having kind of institutional and political power, does that sort of change maybe how we read the genre, or does it not?
Yeah, I mean, on one level, I think it has to, you know what I mean? Because well, part of it is I just don't like Hillbilly Elegy and am reticent to sort of include it within the sort of canon, but in a lot of ways it fits, you know what I mean? It's got the characteristics and the hallmarks. Now, I would say sort of thematically and maybe socially, it's not doing some of the same stuff that other gritlit texts do. But it's definitely it's going to be on the list. You know what I mean? When you Google gritlit and you pull up the list, it's going to be there. And this is also a book, right? That uh, I said Bastard Out of the Carolina is the most influential or the most widely read, but if we're putting Hillbilly Elegy in there, I mean that shoots to the top. It demonstrates the the power, right? That this type of uh, representation, that this, aesthetic can have. Um, I think it's less central to my project as a literary text for some of the reasons I talked about, but it is definitely, it has to be considered as a sort of cultural symptom, you know what I mean? Or something along those lines, you know. Um, the way when it came out and how it got used, right? It became a sort of shorthand for explaining uh, poor white identity, but also poor white political action after 2016. Um, and another thing it does that I don't think a lot of gritlit does is it turns that poor white identity or that poor white experience into an escape narrative. You know what I mean? The idea that um, I experienced these things in childhood, this way of life, but I worked hard. I pulled myself up. I went to Yale, and now I'm out of there. You know what I mean? And now I can look back in retrospect and analyze the lessons that I learned. Uh, Gritlit, I think, it's messier and it doesn't uh, it stays in those waters. You know what I mean? Instead of trying to escape from it. At its most dangerous, Hillbilly Elegy could be, you know, poor white apologetics, explaining why uh, poor white people, support populism or vote against their self-interest or reinforce racist hierarchies, even though they have been historically denied the privileges of those categories. Um, at the least there's something exploitative about it. But I think, as far as do we need to reckon with that? Absolutely, because I think that's more and more kind of where this grit lit stuff is heading. You know what I mean? Is that sort of exploitation, commodification part of it.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and actually, it kind of leads into my next question. So if you've already answered it, that's fine. But I was going to ask you what you think the future of Gritlit looks like. So, I mean, is there anything else maybe you want to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, um, there's a couple strands that it takes, I think. On the one hand, there is that sort of the downside to it, the exploitative, the how can we uh, market this aesthetic to, sell copies or get downloads. But that's not to say that everything is moving in that direction. There's still a lot of uh, literature in this vein that is that is doing similar stuff. And what I think one of the more exciting places that it's headed is more into the sort of environmentalism uh, area. So people like Ron Rash or Ann Pancake take on a lot more like explicitly ecological, topics in their books. Um, and I think that's really an important development in it. Um, so yeah, a couple ways that I think Gritlit is going, and probably uh, would need to sort of focus on those developments. There's a really important, I think, article in Southern Cultures by Zachary Vernon that talks about this idea of romanticizing the rough South. He sort of reads it as this, developing issue, in particular in popular fiction. But I think any conversation of where Gritlit is headed now and in the recent past would do well to kind of start with that article, because I think it lays out the stakes of it pretty well.
Mitch, I want to thank you one more time for being here with us. I have one more question for you. But before I get to that, I wanted to echo this comment from Chris Boone Payne. Uh, in the chat, Chris says, really enjoyed this. I have to go, but can't wait to get my book. Which leads me to say once again that if you are interested in buying this book, there is a 40% off discount code pinned to the chat. But yeah, so thank you all as well for tuning in and spending this afternoon with us. We appreciate it. But yeah, my last question for you is if you could tell us a little bit about what you're working on, what your scholarship looks like now that this book is out.
Yeah. Well, still figuring it out. I mean, couple strands I might want to develop. Um, One, I think really important, like direct follow-up to a book like this would be to expand the range of representation. I am exclusively, perhaps problematically, talking about white authors here. You know what I mean? And so I think a good balanced follow-up would be how have poor white characters or poor white culture been portrayed in, say, Black literature or indigenous literature, and sort of see how that changes or complicates things. Um, because this could, change how we think about like whiteness. So how do Black writers represent, landless whites? There's uh, there's the character, can't remember her name, and Toni Morrison's Beloved. There's a poor white, I think they just call her white girl, that helps deliver a baby, and it ends up becoming a really sort of linchpin moment in the novel that is not just a two-dimensional portrayal of, a white trash character. It's a lot richer than that. I mean, Zora Neale Hurston wrote a novel, Seraph on the Swanee, about poor white Florida crackers. And so I think there's a lot of rich text there. Um, Another project I'm sort of circling is I would love to write about NASCAR, which I think is a subculture that is really interesting, kind of dynamic, and it's going through some important changes. They just had a really important antitrust lawsuit that got settled that sort of has, I guess, changed the dynamic. And they're going very much through an identity thing right now, where they're sort of torn between uh, kind of virtue signaling on the one hand, but also trying to, retain their base, which is not always the most, progressive bunch. But it's still like a lot of this stuff, a little bit more nuanced than meets the eye. So I'd love to do some sort of scholarship on NASCAR. I think that would be really fun. And then one more thing would be, and this is coming from my students, I would love to, I don't know, do some journalistic nonfiction type work on the world of showing farm animals, FFA, 4-H, that kind of thing. When I talk to my students, it's really fascinating how they talk about it as an intensely classed experience, where things like how much money you can spend on genetics or the most, cutting edge supplements, or does your family go to church with the judges or the fair board, how all of that stuff plays into it. So I think that would be a really cool subculture to kind of to put this lens or this focus on as well.
Those all seem like really fascinating projects, honestly. So, just really excited to see what comes next. But yeah, thank you again for being with us. That's all the time we have for today. Before we go, Mitch, is there anything that you'd like to say to the audience?
No, just want to thank everybody again for being here and taking the time. This project has been with me for a really long time, and it obviously means a lot to me. So it's good to know that other people will know of its existence. So hope people check it out, and yeah, at the very least, check out some of the authors that I'm writing about in this book because they definitely are good.
All right, that's all we have for today. Until next time, have a good day, everyone.